That's about as much positivity I can produce about this game, because the rest of my experience with Disaster Strikes was filled with glitches and shocking game design. Firstly, when you lose all of your lives, it simply reloads your last save, meaning you start with the same amount of lives you had then, rather than doing something like, say, a 2D Mario, where if you lose all your lives during a world, you're sent back to the very start, but you still begin with the default amount of lives. If you don't know this and accidentally save your game with only one life left, progressing becomes insanely hard. Eventually I had to resort to using an infinite lives cheat because 1-ups were so rare, and if I didn't add any extra lives I was never going to be able to progress. The very first time the game glitched on me, it wouldn't allow me to shoot, despite saying I had 40 bullets left. Okay, that's a minor annoyance, I'll let it slide. The game then glitched me through an electrified barrier. This meant I couldn't progress as I didn't have the required items to continue going forward, and it was impossible for me to get back through the barrier, no matter how hard I tried. Then the game decided it wanted to glitch the items you pick up, failing to register that I had picked up a key card. Because this key card completely disappeared but didn't go into my inventory, I was unable to progress, yet again. Finally, the game decided it was just flat out not going to let my character move. This was the last straw for me. I just couldn't take it anymore. I'd lost my progress thanks to glitches 3 times now. 1 time is too many, but 3 fucking times? That is unacceptable. There was no way I was going to continue persisting with such a broken, bland, and repetitive game and attempt to complete it. I threw a few opponents like Billy from the Gangrene Gang, Fuzzy Lumpkins, and Mojo Jojo, but it's nowhere near enough. I beat Blossom's campaign in around 6 minutes. 6! On to the next one, I guess. Perhaps there will be different levels and different enemies? Nope. It's literally the exact same fucking thing! But what the heck. It took me 6 minutes to beat the campaign, so let's do the other 2 and see if anything special happens.
A few moments later.
After completing all 3 campaigns in quick succession, I unlocked a special level where I could battle him. This fight was laughably easy like everything else, and once I'd beaten him, that was it. Nothing else for me to do except play simulator mode. I timed how long it took me to beat the game to 100%, and I clocked in at 25 minutes. 25 fucking minutes. Most Flash games on Newgrounds last longer than that. Imagine being a parent, buying this for your child who loves Powerpuff Girls, and keep in mind Nintendo 64 games cost an arm and a leg back then, just for little Billy to beat the game in half an hour. I have no fucking idea how not 1, but 2 publications gave this a 7 out of 10. I usually hate the whole duh, video games reviewers are paid off, but who the fuck could think this is a 7? What's even worse is that of the reviews I read, not one mentioned how ridiculously short the game is. In fact, the IGN review actually made it seem like it was a slog to get through. Yeah, it must have been hard having to play it for an entire 30 minutes. Maybe I was missing a difficulty setting or something, but if I did, it wasn't obviously present, and if there was one, the game clearly comes default on the easiest setting. So, Dexter's Laboratory Chess Challenge is literally just a chess game. It's based on Battle Chess, which was an older series that gave animations to give chess games some more life. Since chess has a pretty rigid set of rules, you'd think this would be a super simple game to make. Yet, Virtuecraft have somehow managed to completely fuck it up. Every single video game based on a board or card game that I have played has always had an extensive tutorial that allows brand new players to become familiar. However, Chess Challenge literally just drops you in and says, hey, figure that shit out yourself. Absolutely none of the rules of this game are explained. You have 4 game modes to choose from: Tournament, Versus, Quick Game, and Puzzle. Notice there's no option for a tutorial or even somewhere where you can just read the rules. If you want to play this game, you better be an expert at chess already. I went into this having a minimal understanding of chess, and this game did nothing to help me improve. Even on the easiest difficulty, this game is just way too hard for a beginner to play. I tried my best to learn on the fly, but it was just too tough. Sure, I could look up the rules on Google and probably be fine, but back in the day when this game came out, there wasn't such luxuries. Now I know how movie critics and parents who were confused by the first Pokemon movie must have felt. Virtuecraft are just so confused about who their target audience is. There's nothing wrong with making a portable chess game that allows you to play chess anywhere. In fact, it's actually a rather convenient thing for die-hard chess fans. But they decided to use the Dexter's Laboratory license for this game, a show aimed at an incredibly young audience who, for the most part, probably have no clue how to play. If you're going to use a cartoon license for a chess video game, you sure as hell better include a tutorial, or at least make it easier. While I am saying this game is ridiculously hard, it's important to note that I literally never lost a game while I was playing. How is this possible, you ask? Because literally every game I played ended either in a stalemate or a draw. Literally none of the games I played ended up achieving a result. How fun. There's no other way to put it. This game is awful. What went through their minds when they made a chess game aimed at kids but didn't want to include any kind of tutorial. If you're going to make a chess game aimed at kids, you need to teach them how to play. And honestly, how many copies do you think this game sold? 10? Sure, it has the Dexter's Lab branding, but what kid wants to play a freaking chess game? If somebody owned this game as a child or knew someone who did, please let me know. We're like 8 games into Cartoon Network's video game history now, and they've made one game that I would class as good. That game also happens to be the very first one they released. Screw this shit, I'm going to play checkers. So, when I looked up what kind of game this was before playing, the Powerpuff Girls wiki described this as an RPG. A Powerpuff Girls RPG sounds awesome, but this couldn't be further from the truth. There's nothing even remotely present in this game that makes it close to being an RPG, so whoever wrote that is an idiot. What this game essentially is a side-scrolling beat-em-up. The story for this game is barely present. Miss Keen sends all the kids of Pokeoaks out on a scavenger hunt. That's basically the full extent of the story. Eventually on their travels to collect everything they run into bad guys, but it feels weird that the central story isn't about a villain, at least initially, but I'll come back to that later. The quality of the game takes a major hit once you have to head to Him's lair for an item. This level is absolutely terrible. Here the level scrolls, something that isn't done anywhere else in the game, and you have to find the correct portals to advance. Doing this becomes incredibly tedious and grinds the pace of the gameplay to a halt, which is jarring compared to how the rest of the game is played. I also found I was able to glitch through walls instead of being crushed by them if I held up or right on the directional pad, which completely defeats the purpose of scrolling in this level. While I'm being mostly negative about the game, Samurai Jack the Amulet of Time is mostly a bearable experience. Unfortunately, the wheels completely fall off in the final stretch of the game. You find yourself heading to Neo Tokyo, which means you know the showdown with Aku is coming. Here, Virtuecraft completely botches the lead up to the big crescendo. Firstly, there's a frustrating platforming section. The clunky controls again come into play here and make this way harder than it needs to be. The second, and biggest mistake, is that the game gives you armor which makes you invincible. Weirdly, the game doesn't make a big deal about this or anything. You just randomly pick it up, pop it on, and all of a sudden you're invincible. Because the game doesn't tell you you're now invincible, I didn't pick up on it for the next 5 to 10 minutes, until I came to a particularly tricky part and realised my health wasn't being affected at all. Once I realised this, I was able to just sprint past every enemy, get to Aku, and defeat him in no time at all. I am baffled as to why they would do this. With the amount of enemies sent at you in the final area and the way the Aku boss battle is set up, it's clearly meant to be a challenge, so why on earth would you give the player an item that makes this the easiest part of the game? Everything is out of whack here, and it makes Aku look like a pushover. There are 14 minigames, which seems kinda small, but when you think that this is on the Game Boy Advance, it's actually a decent batch. However, you only have 4 different game boards to choose from. Maybe they could have fit more in, but the reason they only have 4 is because the characters in this game are only from 4 Cartoon Network franchises. There are only 6 characters available: Eddie, Sarah, Cow, Chicken, Johnny Bravo, and Courage. There are no unlockable characters either. Actually, there's no unlockable anything in this game. This character selection is somehow worse than the one on offer in Cartoon Network Speedway. At this point in 2004, Cartoon Network had a diverse and wide-ranging stable of characters, so it's disappointing to see developers whiff on the character selection in 2 crossover games so far. The biggest problem with tournament mode is how ridiculously easy it is. To win here, you generally need to collect 3 items as well as $50 and then return to the start. The items are earned by winning the mini-games in all boards except Johnny Bravo's, while you'll be constantly earning cash as you travel around. I found that the game can be rather random on whether it awards you an item for winning a minigame though. Many times I'd win games and receive absolutely nothing, and I'm really not sure why. I can only assume this is a bug and not actually supposed to be happening. When it does work properly though, the problem it creates is that you can easily get everything you need in your first loop around the board, meaning games can end in like 10 minutes. It's not even that the AI are incredibly easy to beat in the games, they're actually incredibly competitive in quite a few of them. It's just that there's so many minigames played in your first run around the board that it's almost impossible to not have everything. On the flip side, minigames are made almost pointless in Johnny Bravo's board. In this board, you only need to win 1 minigame because the other 3 items you need are bought with the currency that you earn. This means you can just ignore almost all the minigames and cross your fingers that you get favourable rolls of the dice. You'll most likely beat the entire tournament mode in under an hour. That's if you don't get some shitty luck and lose a game, because if you do, you don't just have to redo that one specific board, you have to start the entire thing again. Considering there's no reward for beating it or anything, I don't see why anybody would want to replay it if they fail at the final hurdle. After you've beaten the tournament mode, there's really nothing for you to do. Mario Party has always been about the multiplayer, with the single player just being a nice little bonus on the side. However, here multiplayer can't really be a focus due to the limitations of it being on the GBA. This means the game has basically no lifespan, as once you've played through the tournament mode, you'll have played all of the minigames so many times that you'll be sick of them. I mentioned earlier that having 14 minigames is a pretty good effort for a GBA game, but what I didn't mention is that most of the minigames are identical. Many of the games follow the same format of just having to follow along with the button prompts on screen, and this gets played out almost immediately. Then there are cases where two minigames are literally identical, but just given a fresh coat of paint. Take Cold Cash Workout and Waltzing Weremoles for example. These two games are exactly the same, but one is given a Courage the Cowardly Dog aesthetic, and the other a Johnny Bravo aesthetic. Overall, there's probably only 5 properly unique minigames on offer here. The lack of diversity is made even worse when you factor in that each board has a preference to what minigames are chosen. If you're on the Cow and Chicken board, you can bet your ass you'll be playing one of the few Cow and Chicken minigames over and over again. This makes the game tedious and a bore to play. The game tries to keep things interesting by upping the difficulty every time you play a minigame on a board. Each game is harder than the last, but this just creates some serious problems instead of making things fresh or fun and interesting. It's particularly obvious in Cold Cash Workout, where the game becomes unplayable after the first time. I also found that I didn't even encounter every minigame despite playing through the whole tournament mode. I'll chalk this down to being a side effect of the boards having a bias towards which minigames are chosen. I played the zombie game literally 0 times, but I played the pig catching and water balloon shooting games like 20 times plus. Finally, there are also numerous cases where minigames aren't explained well enough and you're thrust into it without knowing what to do, or worse, having been told the completely wrong thing to do. You'll get to play as all 5 kids throughout different levels, with each one being set up in the exact same way an episode of the show would be set up. The story of the game is that the adults have passed a Soda Control Act, which has raised the legal drinking age of soda to 13. The kids next door have not taken kindly to this new law and have started running a secret soda smuggling operation to provide kids with their favourite beverages. It's all very similar to Homer becoming the beer baron in the episode Homer vs. the 18th Amendment.
You're out there somewhere, Beer Baron, and I'll find you.
No, you won't.
Yes, I will.
Won't.
Because every single game had to add some silly touchscreen gimmick early in the DS's lifespan, you can attack by strumming guitar strings on the bottom screen. Attacking this way is so cumbersome, and it's incredibly inconvenient if you're trying to string together specific combos. The developers clearly knew the touchscreen controls were pure garbage, because you can attack using A, B, X and Y right from the start, without having to go into menus and change control schemes or anything like that. You can use special attacks by strumming 2 strings at once, or by pressing 2 buttons at once. The game refers to these attacks as desperation attacks, however, it's not really an apt name. A better name would be something like, literally the only attacks worth using. Early in the game, these attacks are extremely overpowered, and there's no real point using anything else. But then, as the game progresses, enemies start requiring more hits to go down, rendering normal attacks completely useless. Late game enemies are your classic bullet sponges. The game gives you 2 difficulty modes, easy and hard. I chose easy, so I can't imagine how freaking long it would take to beat the enemies on hard setting. Just look at how many hits from my special attack these enemies are taking, and yet they still refuse to go down. This brings me to arguably the biggest issue. This game is a brutal, tedious slog. There is absolutely no enjoyment in walking about 10 steps, encountering an enemy or 3, slamming the buttons for 30 seconds, and then repeating until the end of the level. This tedious gameplay is obvious from even the tutorial, and only gets progressively worse for every level you play. Adding on to the tedious gameplay is that there are 2 branching paths in every level. Pick the correct one, and you'll be taken to the boss battle in about a minute. Pick the wrong one and you'll be taken to a dead end, something you'll only realise after you've battled enemies for sometimes up to 5 minutes. What is the point of this? The only answer I could come up with is it's there to prolong the game's life and frustrate players. It seems that the sole objective of Century Sweep Studios when designing levels was to lay everything out so your health is slowly sucked out until you can't do much other than accept death against a boss. The second way to get health is at vending machines. One of the non-useless items in this game is money, which can be used at these vending machines to buy new costumes and new guitars alongside health. At most, there are 2 of these vending machines during a level, and the worst part is that buying a health pickup doesn't even revive a dead Ami or Yumi. But the vending machines also serve as checkpoints. When both of your characters die, you'll go back to these checkpoints and you'll have both characters at full health, which renders buying health absolutely pointless. Why would I buy health when I can just die and achieve a better result? It doesn't make any sense. I will give them props at least on the costumes and guitars. The costumes are fun little cosmetic changes that you'll be getting regularly, and the guitars offer you a wide range of unique attacks. Unfortunately, the game doesn't even tell you how much each item in the vending machine is worth, which means you just have to hope and pray you have the correct amount of money. The same thing goes with the way they present the stories of each level to you. You're met with ridiculously long text boxes of exposition, which are tedious to sit through. It ends up just being a poor man's version of putting across the story from the show. And it's not like anyone needed an in-depth story here, considering they just ripped everything straight from the show. Maybe if the story had been original, these long text sessions would have been more engaging, but because I knew literally every plot point here, it was just a slog. Collision Studios released Camp Lazlo Leaky Lake games on November 6, 2006, just a couple of weeks after they released Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends on the 17th of October. This would probably make you think that the game is rushed and half-assed because they were developing 2 games at once, and you'd be right in assuming that. Camp Lazlo Leaky Lake games somehow makes Collision Studios' Foster's Home game seem great by comparison. The game is essentially a collection of Mario Party style minigames with a loose narrative connecting each one together. Maybe a better comparison would be that it's a collection of Cartoon Network Block Party style minigames, because likening them to Mario Party is a huge disservice to Mario Party. But even though the Block Party minigames were far from perfect, they were still much more well thought out and had a lot more effort put into them than the tripe served up here. When I say Flash games or Cartoon Network Block Party are better, I'm not joking. What's on offer here is really that bad. However, somehow the minigames aren't even the worst part. Remember how I said each minigame was connected with a loose narrative thread? That's the worst part. There's an incredibly boring story here about Lazlo and friends wanting to compete in the Camp Olympic Games or some shit. All I know is this story resulted in me doing dozens of fetch quests. Seriously, all you do between minigames is walk to a person, talk, walk to another person, get an item, then walk back to the first person. These fetch quests are so menial, and the fact that the game has a compass that directs you straight to where you need to go makes them meaningless. There are so many fetch quests that I'd honestly estimate that 90% of my playthrough was spent walking and talking, and only 10% was spent playing the minigames. And why the hell is there so much talking? It's like reading a novel sometimes with the amount of dialogue they were spitting out. Conversations just got longer and longer as you progressed through the game, and this resulted in me speeding things up with my emulator. I played through probably 3/4 of the walking and talking sections at 10 times speed, and the game still took me over 2 hours to complete, and I was still sick of all the walking and talking. I cannot imagine doing all that at regular speed. It would genuinely take you over 3 hours to beat this boring waste of time. My best guess is the developers knew they were shitting out this game alongside Foster's, and they added all the walking and talking as a way to make the game seem much longer than it actually is. Story modes can most times be incredibly rough in fighters, but I think High Voltage did a good job here. The actual narrative itself is pretty nonsensical, which is evident from the very first cutscene where Billy's dad and Eris are just sorta hanging out for no reason. Also, Mandy's hair looks ridiculous in 3D. You're given a flimsy plot about Grim losing his mojo and needing to get it back, but the appeal is really in the humour. I found myself engaged in each of the cutscenes because the humour in the game feels like it wouldn't have been out of place in an episode. Each time I got to a cutscene, I was entertained rather than reaching for the controller to skip to the next fight. Even something as simple as the credits has so much thought put into it. It turns out that the cause of all their problems in the story was because of a mistake Billy made. Mandy remarks that she wishes there was a mode where you could just pound on Billy, and then it immediately cuts to the credits where you can beat the crap out of him. Furthermore, while you're kicking Billy's ass, the credits around you get destroyed by your attacks. For good measure, to make sure you'd want to kick his ass, they make Billy scream, "Destroy us all," so you're annoyed enough to go do it. And to put a little cherry on top, Weird Al fucking Yankovic is the game's narrator.
Super secret unlocked!
Annoyingly though, only 6 shows are represented here. Courage the Cowardly Dog, I Am Weasel, the Powerpuff Girls, Dexter's Lab, Cow and Chicken, and Johnny Bravo are featured, which is pretty much the same shows that were in Speedway. However, unlike Speedway, there is a much bigger roster of characters to choose from. Each show has 3 to 5 characters here, with a number of them being locked at the start. I just don't understand how more shows aren't represented. This came out in late 2006, you have like a dozen more shows to choose from at this point. While it's a bummer that there aren't more shows represented, I must admit the roster is a nice size. The devs were almost forced to include a big roster as they decided to copy Mario Kart Double Dash's 2-driver format. This is something the Crash Bandicoot series also did with Crash Tag Team Racing. Can't think of something original? Just copy Nintendo. Surprisingly, it's implemented rather well. The first racer you choose is the driver and will bring over the kart and its handling, speed, and acceleration stats. The next character you choose is in charge of your special attacks. Each character has 2 special attacks, which can range from things like damaging other racers, shields, or speed boosts. The combo I settled on for the tournaments initially was Johnny Bravo as the driver and Dexter on the weapons, and later I switched to Professor Utonium as the driver with Dexter still on the weapons. What I found is that getting your special ability is far too easy. Cartoon Network Racing has a drifting system, which not only helps you turn sharp corners, but it also powers up a meter. Once the meter is full, you have access to your special ability. The problem with this is that you fill this meter in a flash. It's not too bad if you have attacking special abilities, but Dexter's ability is a turbo boost, and a serious boost at that. This meant that most of the time I'd be getting a ridiculous boost, sometimes every 15 to 20 seconds, which honestly felt like cheating. Unlike Mario Kart, just drifting doesn't give you a boost or anything, so snaking isn't a major problem unless you're racing someone who has Dexter on the back. If you are, then you have a serious problem. I imagine if I had this game as a kid, the house rules would be that nobody is allowed to use Dexter on the back of their kart. I genuinely lost count of how many races I purely won off the back of having such an unbalanced ability. However, I found that in the later races in tournament mode, it wasn't as broken.
Once you actually jump into the game, you'll see that it's divided up into chapters. You'll play through 15 of these, and each one is essentially adapting an episode of the show. While I could imagine this would be an enjoyable piece of fan service for pre-existing fans, this makes the game completely nonsensical if you aren't already familiar with it. It's like getting the Cliff Notes version of the show, but if somebody spilled ink all over the Cliff Notes and you're only getting specific sections. It also doesn't help that there is zero conclusion to any of the chapters. They all just end abruptly. Each chapter is divided into 2 sections, much like the show. You'll spend a portion of it in the real world and a portion of it in Lyoko. If you've seen the show, you know that Code Lyoko does a unique thing where the real world is 2D animation and Lyoko is 3D. DC Studios have tried their best to emulate that here. The 2D sections are basically a point-and-click adventure game, while Lyoko turns it into a 3D action game. This is an interesting concept in theory. In reality, the execution misses the mark completely. In the 2D sections, you'll be tasked with walking around the gang's school and doing various errands and busy work. Movement is controlled via either the touchscreen or the D-pad, although I'd recommend the touchscreen as the D-pad seemed like the most sluggish way to move around. On the top screen you have a map, which is something sorely needed in this game. However, DC Studios have somehow managed to bungle this up. Usually walking up in a game like this would correspond with travelling north on the map, but here that's not the case. The directions are all out of whack, essentially rendering the map useless. This makes traversing the rather expansive world an absolute chore at first. You basically need to memorise the entire layout of the school if you don't want to be constantly stuck. By the end of the game, I did have all of the main locations memorised, which took travelling from being a huge chore to just an annoyance. In general, these sections are just the absolute worst. Honestly, there's no reason for it to exist. It doesn't add anything to the game, and instead, it just pads everything out. It's not enjoyable to spend 10 minutes travelling from your dorm to the principal's office, back to your dorm, back to the principal's office, and then finally getting to jump into Lyoko. These sections generally have nothing to do with Lyoko and have more to do with them dealing with basic school life problems. I also found that they went completely overboard with the world they created here. Why the hell is it so large? I'm not joking when I say there are literally dozens of locations here that you will never see unless you go completely off the beaten path. I sort of appreciate the effort, but why go through the bother of making all these random streets and forests and areas of the school that you won't even end up in by accident if you get lost? It's just bizarre. As I mentioned earlier, each character has a special ability. Ulrich has a force dash. Yumi uses the force to levitate things. And Aelita uses the force to float. And Odd uses the force to climb. I would have much preferred if you could change characters on the fly. At least then it might have seen some use in changing to specific characters to deal with certain enemies. Instead, the only time you'll use it is when you run into an obstacle, forcing you to backtrack to the last checkpoint, then run all the way back. It's just an annoying system. Datorama was the first and only Johnny Bravo game and was released on November 1, 2007 for the PlayStation 2. At least I think this is the correct date for the PS2 release. In general, it is extremely hard to find any decent information on this game, and when it comes to the PS2 version, it might as well not even exist according to the internet. I found a couple of sources citing the November 1st date, so I'm sticking with that. The first weird thing about this game is that apparently it was only released in the UK and Australia. Wikipedia is the only source I have for this, but it would explain why info on the PS2 version barely exists. I'd love for someone from the US to comment whether they owned or even saw this game for sale back in the day. However, if this released information is true, it's absolutely baffling. The next weird thing is the timing of this game's development and release. Johnny Bravo began airing in 1997 and finished its run in 2004. That means this game came out a decade after it debuted and 3 years after it finished. Did they really think Johnny Bravo would still be relevant in 2007? Johnny Bravo is definitely one of the less popular Cartoon Network cartoons from that era, so this is really strange. If I had to guess, I'd say the developers came to Cartoon Network and asked if they could develop a game based on one of their properties, and they were just given this. Speaking of the developers, this game was made by Extra Mile Studios. We haven't encountered them before, and for good reason. Datorama was just their third ever game. They developed a game based on the fucking Smarties chocolate and Lassie of all things, and would go on to develop Chrysler Classic Racing, Shred It, and Aqua TV, which was actually ported to the Nintendo Switch just last year. Want to know another absolutely bizarre thing about this game? There's a Nintendo DS version. When do you think this version came out? A few months before the console version? A few months after? A year later perhaps? Wrong. It came out damn near 2 years later in June of 2009. Well, technically it came to the UK on February 6th, but that just makes things even weirder. To top things off, I cannot find a single review of this game from the time anywhere. It's genuinely like these games never even existed. This is quite possibly the most bizarre background to any of the games I've reviewed so far. What have I gotten myself into? Initially, the game starts out quite promising. Instead of getting to choose your playable character like in Mario Party, you get to choose who your opponent is and which girl you're trying to kiss on. You only have 3 options to choose from in each category, but this seems kinda neat to me. For your opponents, you'll choose from Nick Schweitzer, Marty the Party Biggins, and Big Flavor. I wasn't a huge Johnny Bravo fan as a kid, so I thought these guys must be characters who appeared in the show. Turns out they're actually just random creations, so naturally I picked my boy Big Flavor. The same thing goes for the dates. You'll choose between the Treacle Queen of York, Miss Artichoke, and Miss International Car Show, none of whom appeared in the actual show. Naturally, I picked Miss Artichoke. I'm not even a die-hard Johnny Bravo fan, but deciding to not feature known characters here seems like a huge missed opportunity. The perfect time to cash in on Johnny Bravo has passed by at least 3 years, so your audience is probably only huge die-hard fans at this point. Why not go all in on fan service? To be fair to the game, they actually utilise these made-up characters kinda well. Emphasis on the kinda. Your opponents might as well be a cardboard cutout. I picked Big Flavor because I thought he'd be filled with loads of funny quips. Instead, he appears to be incapable of saying anything other than "that's whack."
That's whack.
Thankfully, your date is much more lively. Miss Artichoke had a lot of unique lines, and the writing is genuinely great. My favourite moment in the game came during the Flower Power minigame. Here you have to pick the right flowers for the date, and before the game she describes which ones she likes and doesn't like. She then comes out with this unbelievable line.
I don't like flowers that are racist. Racism only separates us as a society. So whenever I see a racist flower, I try and teach it tolerance. It's the right thing to do.
It was so out of left field that it popped me hard. There are plenty of these moments sprinkled throughout the game. The opening cutscene is really well written, and the game show is hosted by a sentient pair of lips who has quite a lot of stellar one-liners. Unfortunately, Extra Mile Studios didn't go all the way with this idea. The host's lines are extremely limited. It took literally 5 minutes for the game to start reusing lines, and by the end of the game I was ready to shove scissors in my ears if I ever had to hear this line again.
We're back and front and back and front and back and front and back. We're back, we're back.
Even Miss Artichoke has limited dialogue. A lot of the shine the flowers are racist joke had wears off when you hear it a second time in your one playthrough. It's a bummer they didn't go all in on the jokes here. Whoever wrote for this game is actually extremely talented, but there's just not enough of it, and as a result it becomes extremely repetitive. Once you win 10 games or get some good luck on that rigged ass gambling wheel, you ascend to the top of the podium where Johnny floats like he's Jesus briefly before receiving a date. Unfortunately, Extra Mile Studios managed to mess this up too. You'd imagine that Johnny and Miss Artichoke's date would be a cutscene, right? Wrong. It's a Microsoft PowerPoint presentation. The really annoying thing is that the writing here is still kinda funny. It just needed an actual cutscene to go along with it. There is quite literally one cutscene in this game, so would it have killed them to add in a second one at the end to say thank you for playing through this monstrosity? Well, knowing how game development works, it probably would have killed them. The only thing left to do after beating the game once is to play again on different difficulty levels with different opponents and different dates so you can get a slightly different slideshow to watch. The minigames are not nearly good enough to draw you back in via multiplayer, which ends up meaning this game has a shelf life of 1 hour, because that's how long it took me to beat it. The long plays of this game on YouTube are all around the 50-minute mark, and I have no doubt that you could beat it in 40 minutes your first time through if you get some decent luck with the gambling and minigame choice. This is almost on par with Powerpuff Girls' Chemical Extraction for being the worst value for your dollar. The combat gameplay is no good whatsoever, but it actually isn't the worst gameplay element present. That prestigious honour goes out to the kart racing segments. Yep, this game also has kart racing alongside everything else. In 3 of the 12 levels, you proceed to race in a golf cart around a course against the frat aliens. I thought the racing controlled rather well, so I was optimistic when I started my first race. This optimism was torn to shreds about 2 minutes later. This is the world's most bland and boring kart racing. It's a 1v1 race every single time where the only items are a single homing missile and a speed boost. Races are 3 laps where you need to pass through checkpoints. Tracks are also extremely long and aren't that varied, so you become bored with what you're doing a single lap in. And good lord, the rubber banding in these segments is by far the worst I've ever seen. You will quite literally be neck and neck with your opponent for the entire race. This means if you fuck up even slightly in the final 30 seconds of the race, you are screwed and have flushed 4 minutes of your life down the toilet. There was one case where, by some sort of divine intervention, I managed to get roughly half a track in front. I thought there was surely no way they'd catch up if I continued to race well, yet somehow they caught up almost immediately. I'm not exaggerating even slightly when I say this is one of the least fun things I have ever played in a video game. The DS follow-up was released on November 12, 2007 and was developed by Sensory Sweep Studios. Oh god. Oh god. Oh god. If you've been following along with this series, you'll remember Sensory Sweep Studios from Hi Hi Puffy Yumi, The Genie and the Amp. That was the very first Cartoon Network game on the Nintendo DS and a follow-up to the first Puffy Yumi game, which was surprisingly great. Genie and the Amp, on the other hand, was a disaster, and it's a genuine contender for the worst game I've played in this series. Having Sensory Sweep Studios on board doesn't fill me with confidence. This is also the final Cartoon Network game that would be published by Midway, despite them announcing plans to make a gajillion games. After this title, most of the games would be published by D3 for the next few years. To keep this from becoming too much of a walk in the park, the Space Nut Boogies are littered around the environment, attempting to snatch you up and strap you to their tickling machine. No, I'm not joking. Apparently these guys have some sort of tickle fetish. There are basically 0 combat options present in the game. Blue can shoot spitwads, but these aren't really an offensive maneuver designed to take down enemies. Instead, you're pretty much tasked with sneaking around them stealthily. To aid you in this, you'll find various distractions in rooms such as televisions or boomboxes, which will divert the attention of the Space Nut Boogies. Essentially what I'm saying is that you're solid blue in this game.
Words like fate, karma, it's just an excuse for giving up if you ask me.
It's hot in Topeka.
When you come to level 6, you'll be greeted by a boss rush of all the previous bosses you've faced off against. I'm not sure why, but every second Cartoon Network game seems to feature a boss rush. It's basically mandatory to include at this point. The boss rush battles are slightly different to the original fights due to utilising new environments, so at the very least it's not like you're just completely rehashing old ground here. Once all of those boss battles are done, you come to the finale. Here you find out that Wilt is a no-good, dirty, double-crossing snake bastard who's sided with the Space Nut Boogies.
Oh my god!
This means your final boss battle is against Wilt. The game then just makes the most baffling decisions. It does the classic video game thing where at the very end of the game they introduce a completely new style of gameplay. Even more baffling is that they made the final boss battle come down to simply swiping on the touchscreen. I should remove the term simply from that description though, because this is actually surprisingly hard. It doesn't look like it at first glance, but the difficulty comes down to how touchy the game is about registering your swipes. I never knew whether it was going to register me as having swiped correctly, or whether it was going to say I fucked up and have me instantly fail. There's a good reason why a lot of DS games that utilize touchscreen commands had some sort of on-screen element to show that your movements were registering. Even without that, this whole sequence is way too long. You're just swiping up, down, diagonal and around over and over again. Did they really think this was a fun way to end the game? The biggest kick in the teeth is that they didn't even bother to animate this final boss battle. The top screen merely features a slideshow of Blue and Wilt's sword fighting. To be fair, it's not like you ever would have paid attention to the top screen if it was animated, as the bottom screen swiping needs literally all of your attention. Finishing your game off with what basically amounts to an instant fail QuickTime event is kinda shitty. It sucked when Uncharted did it in 2007, and it sucks here. Harvey Birdman Attorney at Law is quite literally an Ace Attorney game. In fact, I'm surprised they didn't just name it Harvey Birdman Ace Attorney at Law or something. This is completely genius and one of the smartest pairings of a genre and a show that we've seen in Cartoon Network video game history. Harvey Birdman is obviously a show centered around court cases, so what better way to take advantage of that license than slotting it into the Ace Attorney system and having fun parodying the hell out of it. Anyone who's familiar with those games will be right at home here. You'll be presented with 5 cases to play through, each of which is its own self-contained story. The first trial acts as a tutorial, but honestly it's pretty brutal for something that's supposed to ease you into things. They never explicitly teach you how the game works, so you have to pretty much just fumble your way through all these unfamiliar menus and fall ass backwards through this slightly easier case until you get the hang of things. Gameplay is split between 2 different styles. The first style is basically what you'd find in a point-and-click adventure. You'll travel from location to location, gathering pieces of evidence, while also chatting to suspects or people who could potentially help progress the case. After all of your sleuthing is done, it's time to head into the court and attempt to make some sense out of these absurd cases. In court, you'll listen to testimonies and will then have the option to either press them or present a piece of evidence to them. Pressing them will open up new lines of dialogue that could potentially be crucial. Presenting evidence is most commonly the final nail in the coffin. Here you'll be picking out the key pieces of evidence you found in your travels until you end up coaxing a confession or proving their innocence. I'll assume this is a relatively similar, albeit toned down version of Ace Attorney's gameplay. I've never actually played a game in that series, which meant I was coming into this game as fresh as a newborn. However, my biggest gripe about this game is its saving and checkpointing system. Save points are sparsely littered around levels, and if you die, these act as a checkpoint. Unfortunately, rather than being an actual checkpoint, it just reloads your save, meaning all of your stats and health are the same as when you saved. This might not seem like an issue on the surface, but it actually is a massive problem. If you save at a checkpoint with low health and then eventually die, you are fucked. You're almost guaranteed to be stuck in an infinite death loop if this happens to you. In one level, I actually did have this happen to me. I decided I'd try to tough it out. After all, the game does give out items after battles, and sometimes these restore your health. After inching my way through half a dozen battles against singular monsters, I came up to a battle against 5 monsters and immediately knew I was stuck for good. I'd like to note that in those dozen or so battles I won, the game did not give me a single health pickup. In the majority of battles before I was stuck, and in the majority of battles afterwards, I would get a health pickup like 90% of the time. This might be me getting all tinfoil hat, but it honestly felt like the game was deliberately withholding them from me. The game's solution for this is to de-virtualize and restart the mission from scratch. No fucking thank you. Missions can take like an hour to complete at times, so forcing players to play through all of that again is actually insane. I ended up resorting to using cheats. Nico Entertainment were out of their minds if they thought I was ever going to replay through all that nonsense. Finally, the boss battle with the ghost freak looking dude might actually be the worst boss battle I've ever played. In the previous game, boss battles were heavily focused on QuickTime events. This game does away with that, and it's a positive for the most part. This particular boss battle is the exception. In this fight, you have to press a bunch of buttons to alter the room's gravity. This requires you to change out of your alien form and into Ben. The constant changing is incredibly clunky, and the controls really fall to pieces here. You have to press circle to activate a switch, but it was always a dice roll on whether it would actually activate the switch, or just force me to do a safety roll like some parkour nut. I would literally completely stop as Ben, not touching anything else, and then finally click circle, and he still would roll sometimes. It was just far more frustrating than it needed to be. As far as the story goes for Beast of the Fifth Son, I was pretty let down. Look, I wasn't expecting some Oscar-worthy narrative, but some level of flow to the story would have been nice. The transition between levels is ridiculously jarring. I often began a new level wondering what the hell was going on. Every level kicks off with a cutscene, but so many times it felt unrelated to the events of the last level. It's almost like you're watching a movie that has every second scene removed. The story is about some dude stealing 8 monsters so he can blow up the sun. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but then again, nobody was ever playing this for the rich narrative. What I do like about the narrative is the globe-trotting adventure. This is something Protector of Earth did, and it made for a lot of very cool settings. Beast of the Fifth Son has the exact same thing going here. The biggest standout is the Egypt level, where you're running around the pyramids and the Sphinx. The Egypt setting combined with Zack's grappling hook were giving me serious Nathan Drake vibes here. speaking of Zach, good lord does he fucking suck. I'm glad this game was short, because I couldn't stand another second listening to this cringeworthy loser.
A buku about you! But whatever you call it, it's kinda making me hungry.
He only ever opens his mouth to make the dullest of puns or lame jokes.
So seriously, how do you even go to the bathroom in this?
None of this is ever remotely funny or even slightly endearing in a dorky way. When he does open his mouth to try and give some sort of relevant information to the player, he somehow still manages to be annoying. Whenever he encounters a cryptid, he reacts with pure excitement. This is fine out of context, but when you consider some cryptids are friends and some are foes, this is an issue. Zach's "wow, a cryptid" response doesn't help you discern whether it'll try and kill you or not, so you basically just have to expect you're about to get into a fight. The wider cast of characters is all exceptionally dull too. The parents are bland and only show rare hints of personality, and even the wacky uncle character is ridiculously subdued. I think the only character I slightly liked was the main antagonist, purely because he's great in the opening cutscene.